Okay, well, welcome everyone to this live stream forum hosted by Socialist Alternative. My name is Liz Walsh and I'll be facilitating tonight's forum. Socialist Alternative has been hosting these forums every Sunday evening, and I really encourage you to block out Sunday night as a regular time that you tune in for some radical politics. Tonight we're changing speed a little bit. For the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on the coronavirus and the different ways that the crisis has been impacting on people's lives. But today we wanted to change focus and discuss the climate crisis, its relationship to the capitalist system, and the need to fight for socialism in order to save the planet. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever you're tuning in Australia, you'll be standing on stolen Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded over this land, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I think it's important for us to cast our minds back to last year when discussing the climate crisis, because last year was an incredible year. Of course, it was an incredible year of mass rebellion, with protests erupting all across the globe, from Hong Kong to Chile, to North Africa, to France. Millions of people took to the streets to protest against neoliberalism, against inequality, to demand genuine democracy. And sort of running parallel to these mass protests was also an incredible eruption of protest around the climate. We saw massive protests by school students who struck from their class. These school strikes for climate just seem to be growing from strength to strength to strength, as hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Melbourne and Sydney and cities all across Australia. We also saw protests involving direct action, where people put their bodies on the line, disrupting streets, disrupting conferences of mining executives, making the case that in order to save the planet, we also need to be prepared to break the law. And of course, the year ended with some huge mobilisations around the bushfire crisis, protests which were organised by uni students for climate justice. And I think the bushfire crisis really brought home in a visceral way for so many of us what the climate crisis means, that it's not just some ephemeral thing, something that is off in the future, perhaps our children's children will be forced to suffer through, but that the climate crisis is happening now, that it's devastating people's lives now, and that if we don't resist the maniacs who are currently in charge of this system, they're prepared to kill us all in pursuit of profits and in pursuit of power. Now, like so much of what the COVID crisis has meant for us, it can feel like a world away, all of this climate organising, that it's completely overshadowed now by the pandemic, the health crisis, and now by the deep economic crisis that people say will rival the Great Depression, a crisis that is ripping through people's living conditions. And so while it's important that we organise and resist the health crisis, fight for funding for our hospitals, fight to defend our jobs and our living conditions, it's also important that we continue to organise whilst in isolation and as soon as we get out against the threat to our climate. Because the existential threat remains. Not only will there be more fires, there will also be catastrophic floods, heat waves, cyclones and storms. We're on track for global temperature rises of between 3 to 5 degrees by the end of the century, which will make large parts of the world uninhabitable. It will displace millions of people. We urgently need a transition towards renewable energy. We urgently need to confront the corporations and the governments that back them up. These are the people who are standing in our way. Indeed, in the current crisis, we're seeing governments use the cover of the pandemic to push for further attacks on the environment. Right here in Victoria, where I am, Daniel Andrews has pushed to end the moratorium on onshore gas exploration. He's also delayed new laws for the Environment Protection Authority to allow polluting corporations more time to continue to pollute because of the economic crisis, further destroying our public health and our environment. And of course, Morrison is also pushing to reduce any regulations on environmentally destructive projects. This is what Trump has done as well. So tonight we're refocusing on the climate. We're talking about the need to end this economic system which is bringing us to the brink of environmental collapse. And we're discussing the need to fight for a society which can rationally plan the use of our resources, that can radically reorganise the economy so that we can repair the rift between human society and the natural world. So tonight we have two speakers, both of them comrades from Socialist Alternative, both on our national committee. First up, we have Eleanor Morley. Eleanor is a comrade in Sydney. She's a prominent student activist. And during the bushfire crisis last year in 2019, she toured some of the fire-affected areas of New South Wales and reported for our newspaper Red Flag about communities that had been abandoned essentially by the federal government and by the state government. We also have Jerome Small, who is Socialist Alternative's industrial organiser, helping our worker comrades to organise in our unions and in our workplaces. He's also a long-time environmental campaigner. He was a leading figure in the fight to stop the Jabiluka uranium mine. And if you're interested in that campaign, you can hear him speak about it alongside Fleur Taylor in a podcast organised by the Red Flag radio team. So really encourage all of you to get a subscription to Red Flag. Both of our speakers write regularly for our newspaper and have written some really powerful pieces. I also want to encourage you to be a part of the Zoom discussions that will be happening immediately after we finish this discussion, so that we can continue to flesh out some of the questions we'll discuss tonight. And of course, I want to encourage you to get involved with Socialist Alternative, to leave your contact details with us and to fill out the Get Involved form. That way we can call you up, get you active in whatever branch is closest to you. Okay, so I guess we should start by discussing the bushfire crisis and to remember the period before our lives were disrupted by COVID-19, and that going back to normal, if that's what the end of the COVID crisis means, will mean more terrible bushfires. It means incinerating forests. It means the destruction of billions of animal lives, homes, and human life. If we remember the bushfire crisis, it was also when Scott Morrison's contempt for ordinary people was on full display as he went to Hawaii holidaying with his family while the country burned. So Ali, I think it'd be good to start with you, if you could talk a little bit about the significance of the bushfire crisis.
Yeah, for sure. I think the bushfires were a really horrific but also significant turning point in terms of popular consciousness and climate change. Because like you said, climate change is something that has been discussed for years now in an accelerated way in the last few years, but it's kind of felt like this impending threat in the future, something that will be horrific when it hits, something that will be tragic for our children and our grandchildren's generations. But I think this past summer has just really shifted that in a very dramatic way for millions of people in this country. It's finally made the climate crisis and the threat of climate catastrophe a reality for people here. So it was a reality for the millions and millions of people in major cities who were choking on toxic smoke. In Sydney here, it was for months and months and months. It was made a reality for all of us who spent New Year's Eve and New Year's Day staring at the TV, looking at images of families in Malakuta and along the New South Wales coast, literally dragging their families into the oceans as the sky turned an apocalyptic black and red, not knowing if they were going to survive this inferno they could see raging just off the beach next to them. And I think there was this reality to the collective sadness that we all felt from the totally unnecessary loss of human life and the loss of billions of animals and insects that perished in the fires along with the trees. But I think the fires also really laid bare to us exactly how our rulers are going to respond as these threats and these disasters grow and get more severe year after year. Like Liz mentioned, I went and travelled around to a bunch of communities that had been really badly hit by the fires, just devastated by the fires. And almost everything that I experienced by talking to people, you could link back to the decisions made by this Liberal government and successive governments in the past. So the fire services have not been immune from the onslaught of neoliberal cuts over the past few decades. I spoke to a crew in Balmoral in the New South Wales Southern Highlands who on their third day, a crew of volunteers who on their third day of fighting fires that stretched over 100 metres in the air, coming in at them on all three sides, ran out of water in their sole tanker and had to huddle in their fire shelter, not knowing if they were going to survive or not. Stuff like that just should not happen. I spoke to people who were still living next to their destroyed homes 2.5 months after the fires had come through. These people had not seen a single government official. These people had not received anything in terms of state aid. They were surviving based on the kindness of ordinary people who were donating them food and clothes and Christmas presents, etc. So governments who have destroyed our planet through the decisions they make in terms of fossil fuels and production have then left people in this country to burn and perish and suffer because of the decisions they've made. But I think just finally, the other thing we experienced this summer on a more positive note was collective resistance, which was excellent. Like here in Sydney, we had our first rally in November when we had already been blanketed in smoke for a week or two, and there were upwards of 30,000 people. A month later, another 50,000 people, a crowd of angry, defiant rebels who wanted to rip the head off the Scott Morrison government and who wanted to keep hitting the streets so we can start to do something to confront this crisis. So that was amidst all the horror and despair, one kind of positive symbol of the kind of thing we're going to need to continue to confront this crisis as it continues.
And Jerome, could you talk a little bit about what that bushfire crisis meant for workers? I know you talk to a lot of comrades who are attempting to organise in their workplace to defend safety, to defend their conditions during the crisis. Could you speak a bit about the cost for workers of the bushfire crisis?
Yeah, well, the cost to workers from the bushfire crisis is most easily measured in human lives, actually. And there's been a study at the start of March that came out from the University of New South Wales where they've gone through the figures. Excess mortality is the phrase that they use, so above what would be expected in that time of year, given the climatic conditions and all the rest of it. At absolute minimum, they say 417 people are dead because of those bushfires who would otherwise still be alive. Which is a hell of a price to pay. And you see the way that was paid. Like people would probably remember the incident at the Melbourne Open where an elite tennis player collapsed and couldn't continue the game because they were being asked to play in conditions that were 8 times the national standards for small particle pollution. 8 times the level of pollution. Australia Post issued guidelines to every single one of its employees that they should keep working up to 120 times the nationally accepted standard of small particle pollution. That's the sort of tender loving care that employers apply to their employees. So people were left scrambling, looking for advice from WorkSafe and so on. WorkSafe issued extremely weak advice or any at all. I actually got on their Facebook page, Victorian WorkSafe, in the middle of, when it was starting, the smoke was seriously affecting Melbourne, and said, advice on health and safety issues at work, please. And they said, we are unable to comment on whether this is a health and safety issue at work. Like, that was the sort of support that they were getting. And unfortunately, I mean, the construction union here in Melbourne were proactive about it in different parts of the country. The Sydney branch of the MUA actually did what any decent union should do and actually stopped work when the pollution got excessive. But a lot of workers just had to work straight through it. If I can just throw in too quickly, just the priorities of corporate Australia, like firefighters having to fundraise for their own protective equipment, having to make do with a pathetic paper mask when the fossil fuel industry in this country gets a subsidy on the official figures of $12 billion per year. And you can add in the indirect subsidies and you get that figure to $29 billion. Aboriginal community out in Lake Tyers. The one piece of firefighting equipment that they have for that significant Aboriginal community is a ute with a large plastic container on the back, while Scott Morrison spends $250 million on his new plane. And then you work out, like, you know, the wave of philanthropy from corporate Australia that we're all meant to, you know, round of applause for BHP, please, because they gave $2 million. How generous. BHP, $2 million to the Bushfire Relief Fund. You work out the maths without taking you through it. Absolute minimum, BHP, from their fossil fuel assets from coal and petroleum, $1.2 billion in the 4 months that those fires were burning. And $2 million, isn't that fantastic, you know? So we can see what corporate Australia thinks. Their response to the bushfire is stick up the cash while the country burns.
Yeah, it's just criminal. And I think for a lot of people, it's no shock that the Liberal Party, the party that's committed to the interests of big business, it's no surprise to us that they're committed to coal, committed to fossil fuels. But one of the realities of the climate question is that the Labor Party, the opposition party here in Australia, is equally committed to fossil fuels. We had a situation during the bushfire crisis where the new leader, Anthony Albanese, actually toured around the coal mining regions of Australia, declaring the Labor Party support for the coal industry. They also recently downgraded, I think, their climate targets as well to make them in line with what the Liberal Party says that they stand for. We also saw recently, over the last year, the Queensland Labor government extinguish native title for Indigenous people up in the north of Queensland in the Galilee Basin to allow the Adani coal mine to go ahead. So I was wondering, Jerome, if you could talk a little bit about how you understand the Labor Party's ongoing commitment to coal. Why is there such bipartisan support for the fossil fuel industry? One of the arguments that people raise is that Labor are committed to coal because they're just pandering to their working class voter base, that, you know, workers want to see the coal industry continue to save jobs and so on, and that's why Labor are downgrading any kind of even rhetorical commitment to the climate. Does that ring true to you, or what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, well, I think you can tackle that argument a number of different ways. The first way that I'd tackle it is by saying, when did the Labor Party actually care that much about their working class base? You look at the Queensland Labor Party, this one that's meant to care so much about its working class base. A decade ago, that launched on a program of privatisation of Queensland Rail and other state-owned assets that was deeply unpopular, and actually consigned the Queensland Labor Party to the most humiliating defeat for any state government ever in Australian history. But they kept on with that privatisation despite their working class base telling them in no uncertain terms that they weren't going to buy it. So their commitment is actually to corporate Australia at the end of the day, not to their working class base. So, you know, you talk about the strength of the fossil fuel lobby, fossil fuel industry in Australia. Out of our 30 top companies, I think it's 7 are either mining, resource or fossil fuel companies. That's a hell of a lot of power, and Labor isn't going to go against that. All of this stuff about we care about the workers and what they think, I think is just, I think it's bullshit actually. But like another way around it, like just before the coronavirus crisis intensified in Australia, I actually went on a road trip for a red flag, which is a red flag article, which hopefully will see the light of day sooner or later. Just trying to tackle this very persistent myth which is around of the working class coal loving vote. That, don't touch our coal. That's the one thing we've got. We're going to hang on to it. And so for a couple of weeks in late February and March, I toured around the Latrobe Valley, which is coal and power industry centre in Victoria. Wollongong, which obviously has the significant steelworks there and coal mines feeding that and the export industry, and the Hunter Valley, where there was a massive swing against Labor in the last election. And I mean, that's a long story, but if I can, just a few sort of anecdotes, like you actually find surprise, surprise, you find a pretty vigorous debate in all of these places about the future of the coal industry and what it means. Latrobe Valley, the State Electricity Commission employed 12,000 people and paid them decently. 9,000 of those employees were sacked after the privatisation by Jeff Kennett, or it was actually started by Labor, And, you know, like all of those good, secure, regional, well-paying jobs appeared at the stroke of a pen. So, yeah, people do care about those remaining few power station jobs and the money that they bring to the community. But it's pretty massively overstated. And there's a lot of people there. There was a catastrophic mine fire in 2014 in Hazelwood that poisoned the whole town of Morwell at the wider Latrobe Valley for a period of more than 40 days. People remember that. So people have, you know, they've grown up around this. They die earlier than pretty much any other place in Australia in the Latrobe Valley because of the toxic industry. So people know the cost of coal as well. Skip over Wollongong, that's a, you know, interesting story too. But like, if I can tell you 3 stories from the Hunter Valley, and like I sort of said to everyone, look, I'll write up the article, I'll send you the, you know, make sure it's all right. I haven't done that, so I'm not going to use names. Electrician who works down a coal mine, and we're sitting chatting, and I say, so look, so if could you put a percentage, maybe like your workmates, you know, when the chat comes around to climate change, what percentage of your workmates would doubt the science of climate change? And this guy sort of thinks for a couple of seconds. He says, oh, look, anyone under 40, no one doubts the science of climate change. And I sort of do this double take, like, oh, really? And then he does a double take at my double take. And like, what? Is that surprising or unusual? And I realise I've sort of bought into this stereotype of everyone who works down a coal mine must deny the science or whatever. It's just not the case. Anecdote 2, like a retired miner who I was chatting to, who like he'd worked for many, many years, I think 17 years underground in 3 or 4 different mines around the Hunter Valley. He was the president of the Miners' Lodge, the Miners' Union, in a couple of those mines. So it was his job when there was a fatality in the mine to, like, he was the one who knocked off work and went and knocked on the door of the family and told them what had happened. And for him, there was no, like, there's no romanticising this industry. There's no, oh, you know, we love the coal industry. It was a way to make a living, a brutal one, and one that took an incredible human toll. And again, he, you know, for him, it was just, no, we have to change everything. We have to change it straight away. It's just like, what are you talking about? Why is this even a question? And he was saying to me, look, Jerome, it's bad enough down here in the Southern Hunter. Go up to the Northern Hunter where it's all open cast mines, open cut mines. There's a permanent brown haze in the air. Half the kids have asthma. Come on, no. Look, we've just got to find a way out of this. So I think you'll find in a lot of these communities, there's a vigorous debate going on, and Labor just sort of saying, oh, we can't participate in that debate because there's some sort of pro-coal prejudice. It's just bullshit. One final thing on the Latrobe Valley, because there was a massive One Nation vote up there in the last federal election. The guy, Simon Bonds, I think his name was, got 20-something% of the vote. Yeah, the donkey vote, so that sort of helped. Backstory on that, casualisation is a massive issue in the mines. Obviously, 60% of BHP's coal mining workforce nowadays is casual. There's a fellow, Simon Turner, who started a legal case against BHP after he was injured on the job as a casual, got no compo because he was a casual, you know, labour hire casual, that is. And he took it to court. The only, like, absolute disgrace, the miners' union wouldn't touch it. The Labor Party wouldn't touch this issue because, you know, long story, but anyway, the only political force that took this seriously, and you can look on bloody racist One Nation, Malcolm Roberts, you know, Twitter feed to find he is banging on about casualisation in the mines. That's a big part of the One Nation vote there. So yeah, there's all sorts of views and there's, you know, all the rest of it, but that's part of that story. So anyway, that's probably a bit of a long answer, but like this thing of like working people are addicted to coal, just bullshit and cover for the Labor Party.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, it's a much more sort of contested and difficult question for the areas of coal mining communities. But for the vast majority of working class people who are not engaged in coal mining, I think that the question is very much settled as well, that, you know, for something like 75% of people, the question of the climate is absolutely central. The need to transition to renewables is uncontested. And it's clear we need to end the fossil fuel industry if we have any hope of actually saving the planet. I really want to encourage people who are tuning in tonight to put aside May 15, the afternoon of Friday, May 15, because it's a part of a global climate strike. We clearly can't hit the streets in our millions like we would like to. So instead, it's going to be a digital climate strike. We'll be having speeches. There'll be a chance to express your protests at government inaction on the climate by making signs and taking pictures, and also connecting with activists from around the country. And that's being organised by uni students for climate justice. So that's on May 15 on Friday. Really encourage everyone to get involved in the digital climate strike. Okay, now as socialists, we put the interests of working class people at the heart of our politics, and a lot of the sort of discussion around things like the Green New Deal, which has been advocated by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has been to say that a Green New Deal can be a just transition for working class people. But for a lot of socialists, the argument that there can be both an increase in working class living conditions and growth in the capitalist economy, but based on green capitalism, seems like an anathema that is actually a utopia, and that these are really quite limited proposals when it comes to the kind of scale of the crisis that we face. So, Ali, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what your thoughts are on the discussion about green growth and green and the Green New Deal.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing is there's a lot of different Green New Deals. The most recent one that I've heard proposed is from great socialist Malcolm Turnbull. I know there's another one put forward by the neoliberal nightmare that is the European Commission. But obviously it's the more kind of progressive versions like those popularised by AOC and Sanders, like you mentioned, that have really kind of captured the attention and the loyalty of a lot of people, progressive people, in the new climate movement that's developed. And I think there's lots to agree with them in terms of individual policy suggestions or individual things that need to be changed about the way the economy is organised. So ending the fossil fuel industry, for sure, 100%. Expanding public services, fixing our destroyed public housing, public transport systems. Also centralising this question of a just transition. So, making sure that people who currently work in environmentally destructive industries aren't left out to rot, but actually, can still sustain a life in a sustainable economy. But I think the problem with it is that at its core, it's a utopian strategy as a whole for how to confront impending climate chaos. I think resting on this idea of green growth is really, really dangerous. Green growth says that we can both reorganise all of the economy to be environmentally sustainable, improve the living conditions and living standards of working class people all around the world, all while capitalists and bosses can not just maintain, but expand their profits. I think these things are incompatible with each other. It's a political strategy that says we just need to get the kind of right, well-meaning leftists into parliament, and then in that way, they can push through this new kind of plan for industry and the environment that will be agreeable to everyone in society. Again, I think it's utopian. I think in reality, capitalism is an economic and social system that is totally built around the ruthless, competitive accumulation of profits on the market. And it is run by a totally self-interested ruling class. And what they're myopically focused on is their short-term profits. How much is going in and going out in the next 6 months, in the next year? Is it more than my rivals? Will I stay ahead? Who can I kick out? Am I going to get kicked out? It's the sole thing that guides economic decisions under capitalism. And actually, the way you get a competitive advantage against your rivals is to be more socially destructive, to be more environmentally destructive, to flout more rules, more regulations, work people even harder, squeeze every last drop out of us and the environment. I think what we actually need is to totally transform the priorities of production. We need to produce things for human need and not profit. The profit motive needs to be abolished for any idea of a future of social justice and environmental justice. We need to actually dismantle all of the industries that the rich and powerful currently have as their base for that wealth and for that power. And I think that what this strategy entails is actually a revolutionary rupture with capitalism, a revolutionary rupture with what we have right now. We need to get rid of the people at the top, not expand their profits. We need to get rid of them and put the economy and society into the hands of the working class, into the hands of the people who are currently making society run right now. We need to expropriate and not kind of plead and beg the climate criminals who are currently running the world.
And Jerome, do you have anything you'd like to add to this point about, I guess, the idea about various schemes that can both fix the climate and expand the interests of capitalism?
Yeah, because well, one sort of, I guess it's a bit of a case study of some of these schemes is what's happened in Germany, which while I was driving around or just before had a bunch of publicity, and there was all this stuff about how Germany is exiting the coal industry without sacking a single miner. So I spent a little while looking into it, and unfortunately, it is like there is just a huge amount of bullshit and greenwashing involved in this. You would think if any country in the world could manage the sort of transition that we need, which, you know, just a reminder, like we're at 1 degree warming so far. That's all of the fires, that's all of the bleaching is 1 degree warming. If everyone meets their Paris Accords, which almost no countries are, we're going to hit 3 degrees really easy, so 3 times as bad. You would think if one country could stand out and really lead the way, it would be Germany. And just, I mean, yeah, okay. So they closed down their last black coal mine in 2018. That was, oh, our hands are so clean and coal-free. They haven't stopped using black coal in Germany. They're just importing their coal from places where it's a whole lot cheaper, such as Colombia. So, in fact, it's closing down tightly regulated, well-unionised German coal mines, you know, which are fairly deep and fairly expensive, to low-cost, blood-soaked coal from Colombia, which sets records regularly for how many labour activists are killed every year. So, oh, but our hands are so clean in Germany, you know. They've got a transition that they will stop using black coal for electricity in 2036, but they'll still keep using it for steel. I'll come back to that. Brown coal is much more significant in Germany, much more low cost, and there's, you know, eventually they'll phase it out in 2038. But their main plan for phasing out brown coal is to replace it with gas. Now, gas burns cleaner, produces less CO2, but if you've looked into the actual science and what people are saying about it, because every stage of extracting gas, processing it, transporting it, and using it, it emits methane. There's fugitive emissions is the term. And methane is 86 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's like, oh, again, oh, great clean hands that the German capitalist class has got for this transition. And then, like, and finally on the steel industry, because like even once they close down the coal industry, they'll keep importing black coal to use in their steel industry, which, you know, Germany is a significant player in. I think it's ThyssenKrupp is one of the big steel companies over there that, you know, there's a huge publicity about, we've got this green hydrogen steel coming. We use it's just, you know, incredible technology. And it is incredible technology to the extent that I can understand it. That's one of 3 or 4 similar schemes around the world. Sweden's got one, there's one in America and so on. You look at the sort of money that's being put into these pilot plants to produce this carbon-free steel. You get figures like 70 million, 150 million. This is what's being spent in transforming the steel industry, which is a significant player in CO2 emissions. The global value of the steel industry is $2.5 trillion every year. So it's just this little chicken feed that they're throwing out, basically greenwashing. And the problem, of course, is what Ellie said, like the logic of capitalism is every player in the steel market is looking over their shoulders to every other player. No one wants the high fixed cost of adopting this technology that does work at scale immediately. So it's the competitive logic of capitalism that's, you know, it's baked into the whole system. And, you know, German greenwashing is not going to fix that. Like, they are moving way too slowly to hit the targets that we need to meet. So I agree with Elliot. I just think it's you know, in large part supportable measures, sure, but as a scheme, it's just this utopian greenwashing for capitalism, actually.
Right. Well, that's some really quite interesting details there. I think a lot of us were quite beguiled by the headlines that were coming out from Germany and shared some of those articles. So I think it's really a good reminder to dig a little deeper and uncover the facts of the situation. If we just shift gear a little bit, I want to, I guess, touch briefly on what is a long-running debate in the environment movement over what attitude to take to immigration. Socialists reject the argument that population growth is to blame for environmental destruction, and we think there's a lot that's wrong with the argument about overpopulation and the politics around what's known as lifeboat ethics. So yeah, I was wondering, Eleanor, if you could, I guess, explain why we're so hostile to the overpopulation argument.
Yeah, well, I think this has got to be one of the single most repulsive arguments that comes up in the climate movement. And really, unfortunately, in the past couple of weeks, it's had this kind of new wave on the margins with the health crisis that's been unfolding, which has been summed up in this slogan some people might have heard, COVID-19 is the Earth's vaccine, we are the virus, which is just so shockingly cruel and anti-human when you consider what that is saying. It's cheering on the deaths of people in hospitals in New York, in the UK, in Wuhan, all across the world. Potentially millions of people could die from this health catastrophe. And to celebrate that as something good for the environment, I think is just so appalling. But the argument's also, it's kind of similar to the one about consumption, that, you know, the environment's being destroyed just because ordinary people are producing too much. We want too many TVs, we want too many cars, etc. But it's a more anti-human, more awful version of that. And firstly, I think the problem with this is that it shifts the blame away from the ruling class. It shifts the blame away from the people who actually make decisions about what methods we use to produce what we need, and onto ordinary people. Even on its own terms, it totally fails. I read the other day, the richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for half of the world's emissions. And conversely, the poorest half of the world's population, which is 3.8 billion people, are only responsible for 10% of the world's emissions. Think of the Adani coal mine. If the Adani coal mine goes ahead, it will produce more emissions annually than all of New Zealand does 3 times over. So you could just wipe out New Zealand, but you build the Adani coal mine and you've got a 3-fold increase in emissions. I read another article yesterday that said methane gas, which is escaping from oil and gas plants in Texas, is actually warming the earth at almost the same rate as the total carbon dioxide emissions from every home in the United States. And that's just one. Think of, you know, how many fracking projects there are around the world, how many oil and gas wells. It's just so incredibly disproportional. And again, I think what is key, like I said earlier, is how do we organise production? You know, do we harness the natural resources we have available to fuel our cities, fuel our production, or do we not? You know, do we overproduce and then dump food back into the environment after having produced it in unsustainable ways? Plan how we're going to produce resources and how we're going to distribute them. But I think finally, it's got to be said, like that, it's just one of the most reactionary and almost always racist arguments that is made in the environment movement. Because where are the most densely populated countries in the world? It's in the global south. I think what we need to confront the crisis, it's international solidarity. It's going to be international mass movements, workers' movements, linking up together, challenging the climate criminals who run the planet. And arguments like this just point us in totally the wrong direction. We should be thinking about how to expropriate and overthrow the climate criminals at the top of society, not how we plan which countries or which populations don't get to exist anymore.
Yeah, Eleanor, I think you're really right. It's absolutely critical that we reject all of the arguments, essentially, of the eco-fascists, the people who want to see eco-authoritarianism and really fight for politics in the environment movement that's in support of refugees, in support of freedom of movement, that calls for open borders, and that is centred around international solidarity. And I think it'd be good if we could finish up tonight by talking a bit more about what kind of politics we think is critical to fuel a radical climate movement. We've touched a little bit on some of the weaknesses, obviously, of a reformist approach, as well as obviously rejecting out of hand all of the arguments of the eco-fascists. But it'd be good to fill out a bit more what we think a strong climate movement would stand for. So, Jerome, how about you start off on this?
Yeah, well, one of the rallies that Eleanor referenced before, we had a Melbourne version in pissing rain in the middle of the bushfire crisis with 30,000 people, and I tried to address that question, and I reckon there's a few different elements to it. Partly, you need a mass movement. You know, history has always been changed by masses of people, not by not by tiny isolated minorities. Second, you need a persistent movement. No movement has made significant social change in history just by having one big protest and then going home. Actually, it's worth pointing out, we've taken some significant steps thanks to Greta Thunberg and the tens and hundreds of thousands of high school students around the world in that regard in the last few years. Like, you know, up until a couple of years ago, the dominant politics in the climate sort of space, I suppose, was take shorter showers, lobby the government and hope for the best. And so we owe Greta and her comrades a huge debt for saying we need mass action, we need radical change. Now, what that means is a whole discussion, but that's don't let anyone tell you a protest doesn't work, because those protests have changed the conversation worldwide about climate change. To add to that, we need a militant movement. There's been no movement in history that's made significant social change that doesn't have at least, you know, that sort of edge of direct action of civil disobedience, whether that's civil rights, whether that's anti-war in Vietnam days, anti-uranium, and so on. You know, that is sorely needed in the environment movement. And we had, you know, a go at creating some of that, and saw a bit of that outside the IMARC, the Mining and Resources Conference in Melbourne last year. We need a defiant movement, like that rally that we held in the pissing rain in Melbourne in the middle of the bushfire crisis. Dan Andrews, you know, everyone's favourite Labor Premier, tried to get us to call it off. And actually a lot of environment groups and a lot of people around the left were like, oh, it's too much, you know, demonstrating in the middle of the crisis. Whereas we're going, no, this is the time that people are angry. This is the time we need to take action. This is the time we need to hold our government to account. And 30,000 people agreed with us. Now, you need some decent politics to stand up to pressure like that. And it was significant that Uni Students for Climate Justice were the people who called the rally. That's an organisation that socialists play a leading role in, and you know, it's to their enormous credit that they refused to buckle to that incredible pressure that they were being put under. Because if you're going to buckle at a hurdle like that, oh, state premier says you can't hold a rally. Oh, okay, we'll just go home. You're never going to change anything. So we need a defiant movement. We need a movement that involves workers, and we've got a shit ton of work to do. Like, we've got a lot of work to do on that score. You know, I think more to do with the general state of Australia's unions, you know, than anything else. And then I guess the final thing that I've actually finished my speech on at that night was, we need, like, when you look at what we're up against, you look at, you know, the profit motive, you look at the power of the fossil fuel industry, you look at the competitive logic of capitalism, you need a movement that rejects all of that logic and all of that power. And so the phrase I used to finish my speech, which I thought was pretty decent, was, you know, we need to end the rule of the 1%. And that got a huge bunch of applause. The people coming up straight after me were these two young Indigenous speakers, and they were sort of listening to my speech and seeing the crowd react, and you know, you could sort of see them firing up. Pretty much the first words out of their mouths were, if we want climate justice and we want social justice, we need a revolution. And the entire crowd erupted. Like, that's the sort of, like, we actually do. To win the world, we need a revolution. And I would argue that you need, you know, that socialist politics has an incredibly important, and socialist organisation has an incredibly important contribution to make to that.
So true. It was so inspiring to be with the tens of thousands of people in the pouring rain, determined to stay out as long as we could, yelling our hearts out. calling for radical change. And Eleanor, I was hoping that you could finish up a bit more on the question about the fight for socialism and what we mean by socialism. How can socialism actually save the planet?
Yeah, well, I'm also totally for mass, angry, defiant, rebellious movements. The more of them, the better. Can't wait until we're out of isolation and hitting the streets again with thousands of people. But I think what we ultimately need to be fighting for is socialism. I think any pretense that we're going to fix the disasters that have been produced by capitalism within the bounds of the society that they oversee are just wrong. Socialism is about putting the economy and society into the hands of ordinary people. It's about producing and distributing things solely for the purpose of human need and the collective advancement of human society, rather than the profits and the interests of the 1%. And I think that in a society like that, it is utterly inconceivable that we would decide to keep making things in a way that is oppressing whole swathes of the global population, and that is destroying and undermining the very basis of human existence, which is the natural environment. We could decide to radically transform the way that we produce things, the way that we use energy, the way that we transport things around the world, so that it meets the need of the global population, but also stops destroying the environment that we always exist in. And there's so many things that you could do so quickly, empower the world's leading climate scientists to actually start to enact the varied and creative plans they've already come up with to try get some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, to test out alternative forms of energy, to transform the cities that we live in, to stop being these alienated hellholes and into thriving, sustainable, collective, social spaces. There's so much. When we, the majority, get to democratically and collectively make the decisions about how society runs, we can reconstruct the world for climate and social justice. And I think that despite the kind of fear and despair that is gripping so much of the world right now, one, terrifying health pandemic, 2, economic crisis, but 3, that environmental catastrophe has not gone away. Let's see what next summer looks like. Despite the despair that is all producing, I think there is so much to fight for right now. And I would encourage anyone listening to this to join the people that want to fight for a better world.
Yes, the fight for a better world is definitely something that socialists commit our lives to, commit our time to. And the pandemic has clearly made it very difficult to organise in. We aren't able to have the mass meetings, to be with people on the streets. But this lockdown won't continue forever. And it's important that when we come out of the lockdown, the climate movement is in as strong a shape as possible, that we're ready to leap into action. And as part of making sure that our muscles don't atrophy and making sure that we're in as good a position as possible to really disrupt the system as we fight for our future, it's really important that people join with the Uni Students for Climate Justice on May 15. It's a global climate strike, a digital strike, and it's part of making sure that we can continue to build our forces while we're in isolation. So that's all we have time for tonight, and I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you, Jerome and Ali, for your contributions. It's both harrowing stories, but also stories that hopefully inspire you to be a part of mass resistance. We have these forums, like I said at the start, every Sunday night. Every Sunday night we are discussing different topics, whether that's about the coronavirus crisis itself or about key political questions for socialists. And so next week we're actually going to be discussing Lenin and the Russian Revolution with Sandra Bloodworth and Jasmine Duff. The Russian Revolution is really one of the all-time high points of working class people attempting to transform society, to make it democratic, to make it run in the interests of human need instead of profit. And there's a lot for radicals and revolutionaries to learn today from the Russian Revolution, thinking about questions like, how do revolutions happen? What is it about the crises in the capitalist system that compel people to resist? And what are the political challenges that happen as we, and that emerge as we try and change the world? We'll be discussing the transformative impact that revolutions have on ordinary people. Lenin liked to talk about revolutions as festivals of the oppressed, as women, minorities, and others come forward and find their own voice. It's also a question about the importance of internationalism, of spreading the revolution, that we don't think that you can build socialism in one country, and we're firm opponents of Stalin's counter-revolution. So a lot to discuss, a lot to learn, and that will be introduced next Sunday night, 7 o'clock, with Sandra and Jasmine. And Sandra has actually written quite a lot on the Russian Revolution. She has a book about how workers took power, which you can get from the Red Flag bookshop. You can order it online and we'll send it out to your house. And she's also published on Lenin and some of the debates about Lenin's legacy and the contested legacy in the Marxist Left Review, which is the theoretical journal of Socialist Alternative. So I really encourage people to tune in again next Sunday night. Also, make sure you've left your name on our Stay in Touch list. Go to redflag.org.au/get involved. And lastly, please join our Zoom discussions. We'll be starting them up straight away after we finish this live stream, and you can meet other radicals in your state. So click on the link if you are in New South Wales or Victoria or WA, wherever, anywhere across the country, you can be a part of discussions with other rebels and radicals. So thanks again. Thanks for everyone who's contributed to the live stream discussion and debate, and we'll see you all next Sunday. Thanks again. Goodbye.